This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Salam Rafia, thank you so much for taking part in the MENA Talks podcast with me, Shada Islam. Rafia, you've written a lot about the politics of women and the hijab. And now, of course, you're following and commentating and writing about the protests in Iran following the death of 22-year-old Gina Maisa Amini, a young Kurdish woman and student who died on September 16th after the Iranian morality police took her into custody for allegedly wearing un-Islamic dress. The protests were initially sparked by women who were angered by Amini's death, and they were directed against the compulsory wearing of the hijab. Rafia, were you surprised by the intensity of the emotion and the response of Iranian women?
No. And the reason for that is simple. And it is the fact that when you are living in a system which constantly treats you as a second-class citizen, and it's obviously not only the hijab, that's not the only way Iranian women have been mistreated by their own regime, but just the general feeling that you're living in a world that doesn't want you. If anything, I would say I'm surprised that it has taken quite so long for there to be an uprising like this. I know that the protests have centered the hijab as sort of an emblem of the regime's oppression. So in this sense, the hijab has emerged as a political symbol like it has in other contexts. But, I always also try to emphasize the fact that in Iran, since 2018 in particular, when, in 2015, the US, there was a nuclear deal, some of the sanctions were lifted, and Iran appeared to be doing better. But then, of course, in 2018, Donald Trump turned that around. And since 2018, the unemployment rate for women in Iran it's double. It's like almost 24%, which is something that people forget. Iran's women, particularly urban women, have a very high they have a very high education rate.
That's right. Yes.
And so, you have a population that is highly educated, but that is unable to get employment. And of course, you hold that against inflation, which, I was reading the price of chicken in Iran is has increased 20 times since 2010. The inflation rates of basic goods the prices it's nuts. It's like 1,500% increases in the price of staples. So when you have all of that, of course, the people are going to rebel. Right. And the people that are most vulnerable are going to rebel the most. That's because right. They're taking the hit.
That's right. That's right. And as you said, the economy is in very bad shape in Iran, and that's partly due to the Western sanctions as well.
Precisely.
Of course, we have to say that. And of course, you're right. The protests may have been sparked by the women who were angry at Amini's death, but now they're morphed into something more general. There's people are joining in, older women, older men, conservative women, people from all walks of lives have joined. There's just become really a grassroots uprising, in a sense, against the leadership in Tehran. And aren't you impressed by the bravery of these people? Because the state authorities, the security services are really hitting back big time. But yet the protests, what we can see of them, despite internet bans and all the rest of it, the protests are going on, right?
Absolutely. It's interesting to see first of all, that the protesters remain undeterred, but then also that they're starting to engage with wider issues. If anything, I've also been, the one thing I have been surprised by is the age of the protesters, how young they are. Yesterday, for instance, I was watching a video of a protest that was at, I believe, Tusi Technical University in Tehran. And it was all these students, and they wanted to end gender segregation in their cafeteria. So, you have, in my view, the most successful protest movements begin when you have like the central core, right? You're protesting against the regime, but they are made sort of locally relevant from these very specific issues that people are facing. I think in Loristan there was another. But you're right. The regime is hitting back. One of the ways they're doing that is even, being at the gravesite of the people, of the young protesters that have already died in the protests, and then arresting all the young people who are there to pay their respects. So in that sense, I don't even know if impressed is the right word. I'm actually just in awe.
Exactly.
Of these people. But I won't lie. I mean, I also identify with the rage, that internal rage that you feel when you are, publicly mistreated. I know that Pakistani women have experienced this as well, because you get absolutely fed up of the complete callousness and the constant belittling and humiliation that you experience in the public sphere just because you're a woman. And of course, if you experience that day after day after day, as Iranian women have experienced, you are going to be full of fury. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely am in awe of their fury, and I'm also in awe of the fact that they have been able to channel their rage in this very constructive and now, emerging a cohesive sort of movement that is directed towards the regime.
Right. And, Rafia, I was reading up, of course, and watching just as you are. And there were some commentators who said something rather interesting, I thought. They talked about the emergence of a global Iran, a young, new Iran that was emerging. And I wonder if the regime actually understands the depth and the intensity of this rage that you talked about. And so these demonstrations, these protests are a bit different, aren't they, from what's happened in the past? Because there have been moments of anger erupting in the streets. We had that in 2009 in Iran as well. That was about the election results, and students who were out there thought they'd been manipulated. There were protests in 2019, which was about the price of gasoline. So this has happened before. But this time it is different, isn't it? And that's not just because women are involved, but I think also because young women, young men are also involved.
My analysis of this is that, of course, in places where there is significant oppression, platforms such as social media, other forms of interaction through the internet become even more important, right? I've seen that, especially among populations like, so women in Iran, facing the problem that they face, it is natural that they would turn toward a medium that lets them, talk to each other as freely as possible. But the difference that I see, and I think it's crucial for this global Iran kind of understanding, is that following the COVID pandemic, a lot of the rest of the world was also thrown into this world of restriction where, the virtual realm became the primary realm through which people are interacting. And I think that that's what's different, is that when all of us were pushed towards that virtual realm, it has actually increased in richness and increased in its capacity to actually become the medium of interaction globally. So, so I think that there is a lot, and of course, I mean, other people have pointed out, of course, that this regime. Look, every regime, this regime was revolutionary, like way back in 1979 when the revolution happened. I mean, now it's 2022. They are now the establishment, and and the revolution, as we see it happening, is against them. So some of it also is their inability sort of to keep up with the times.
Yes, and critical saying their inability to reform, to actually undertake some very important reforms. So all that people can do is be out in the streets because there's no other channel for change.
Right. And in addition to that, their base, is the regime's base is a rural male base that was kind of the mainstay of how they fed their revolution. And then following that, all the different transitions that they faced. But the fact is that, when you have inflation that drives up the price of staples by 1,500%, which is an insane number, then that base is also disgruntled. And while they may not join the protests, of the younger people, they are more likely to sit back and watch rather than, try to send these young people home.
That's right.
So there is a confluence there in that has sort of promoted that. I mean, I think, there is a tendency again in the West to sort of look at these emerging protests, particularly in Muslim countries, as sort of emanating singularly out of, I just don't like the hijab and I want to wear jeans and be out in the street. Which, I mean, that's, that is, I wouldn't even call it the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about just that, Rafia. So, as in the past, these demonstrations are being watched and commentated on by people across the world. And there's an added poignancy to this one, isn't there? Because women across the world, now this did not happen with the Arab Spring because there was solidarity, but people were not just focused on the women because women weren't leading those protests. But women around the world, and especially in the West here, have been making some very strong statements of support. And you may have seen, I'm sure you did, a number of celebrities and politicians are cutting off bits of their hair to show their solidarity and support. And Canada's Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, recently called a virtual meeting of women foreign ministers from across the world. But I noticed that, for instance, the Indonesian female foreign minister, Retno Marsudi, was not there. So they were mostly Western foreign ministers, women foreign ministers. And you've recently written a piece which I thought was really interesting. You said, of course, what was happening in Iran, in terms of patriarchal policing of what women wear is terrible. But you also talked about Western double standards. And I want to explore this with you a little bit. So are these women in the West who are showing so much solidarity for Iran, what does it say about their, let's say, interpretation of what's happening in the streets? Do they really understand the social, political, economic context of what's happening in Iran at the moment?
That's, that's a great question, but also a very broad one. I think that, I mean, I'll start with what you said about the Female Foreign Ministers Conference, and I saw that as well. I have somewhat limited faith in some of those convenings, and the reason for that is simple. I mean, if you want Iran to prosper, that would be Iranian men and women. The major thrust should, of course, be that they don't face the sanctions that they are currently facing, because and there's a tendency for people, and it's happened in the Iranian context, happened in the Afghan context as well, where it's like, oh, well, that's helping the regime. Well, people need to eat, and you can say regime this, that, whatever, but the fact is that if you want to help those people in any kind of concrete way, and there are definitely ways in which any sort of lifting of sanctions could be tied to different incentives that increase the sort of democratic quotient. But I'll say that as like the background is that I feel that some of the solidarity is disingenuous in that sense, in that, you're asking for the imposition of more sanctions against Iran, and at the same time saying, oh, well, I'll cut off this bit of my hair, or, something similar. And that will be solidarity with Iranian women. I will also say that, the West has always been very, very attracted, infatuated, in love with, this idea of freeing women from the whale. Like, I have written about it at length, like for my whole, I've been writing for about 12 years now. I've written about it ever since I started writing. And it predates that, of course. I mean, in my book, I talk about how in 1979, Edward Said wrote a diary about a dinner party he went to in Paris, where, right as these protests were beginning, and Simone de Beauvoir was there, and she kept saying, I want to go to Iran to free women from the whale. And the fact is that the Iranian revolution, just like this current protest, is about the whale only in a very superficial sense, right? Because in terms of political optics, things like the whale are just like fantastic, right? Because you can't improve a country's economy in a flash. You can't improve law and order in a flash. You can't, change all the laws in a flash. But one thing you can do is force women to wear the veil. And then, of course, there is an immediate transformation of that society in a very visible aesthetic sense, because look, now all the women are veiled. And the awesome thing about these protests that are going on is that they've used that very particular mechanism to try and do the opposite, which is that we are taking off the veil. And I think that is it's brilliant, because it hits
the power.
Exactly, it hits the power right where they don't want it to. But of course, these issues are connected to larger issues, and the greatest difference that I see in the Iranian protests that's most heartening for me as a Muslim woman is that in the past, most of these remove the veil type actions have been top down. Okay, so the queen of Afghanistan takes off her veil and then, encourages all the other women, Afghan women, to, this is like way back in the day in the 70s, take off the veil. Similarly, in Iran, the Farah Pahlavi didn't wear the veil, and then that was incentive. But this is different because it's coming from the ground up. It's coming from the grassroots. And that is what works when it comes to cultural and political transformation. It has to come from the bottom, because that is, that's the basis of sustainable transformation. And so my excitement with this particular movement, and, I acknowledge, I hope they are successful, obviously, in toppling the regime and changing these laws. But even if they're not successful, this will continue, because when you have such a groundswell of grassroots level uprising, that doesn't just go away. You can maybe quash it or suppress it for a little while, but without the changes in material conditions, it's not going to go away.
That's right. It's not going to go away. And, the cries are of women, life, and freedom. So I think those are, as very, very strong and powerful statements from the general population. So what you've said, something that I found rather interesting as well in one of your columns, Rafia, you said when white and Western feminists get involved in these kinds of struggles, of, let's say, Muslim women in parts of the Muslim majority world, it's not about the struggle, you say, but about the rescue and the saving. So that, I think, is also quite an important commentary from yourself. And I was just wondering if you could, explain that a little bit more to us, because it seems to be very much part of the Oriental trope, isn't it? Where people go and try and save the submissive Muslim woman wearing a hijab, the veil, and not very visible, powerless, and has no agency. And of course, being repressed and suppressed by very angry and awful brown men, Muslim men. That's a trope that just doesn't go away, does it?
No, because it's a trope that's used in two ways, right? When you have, I don't know, say, the foreign ministers meeting that you gave an example of, or even here in the United States, you have any number of officials within the Foreign Service who are engaged with this. The point is that it's much easier to pretend that you can go rescue other people than to look at the reforms that you need within your own society. And there are two, I think, important points, two important things to say about this. Number one is that when Iranian women start up with the veil, the idea is that here in the West, we don't have a veil. We're not oppressing women that way. And so therefore we are better off. That's the subtext, at least, is that, we're better off because we don't have a theocratic regime. But of course, here in the United States, we've just lost a huge, battle for bodily autonomy. In legislature after legislature in the United States, conservative white men have stood up and talked about how, her being women's bodies are not their bodies when they are carrying. In fact, women in Iran currently have greater rights to have an abortion than they do in many American states. So so that's sort of like the mix, is that women on either side, we told, well, you're better off because you don't have to face this. And then you get them all embroiled in this rescue fantasy, and they don't look at how they themselves are oppressed. So so that's one point. The second point is that, if we're going to decenter whiteness and white women from the feminist movement, which I have, which I argue for repeatedly, then you have to allow the possibility that the leadership of the feminist movement, the ideological leadership or the activist leadership, is located in places other than the West. So in this case, that would be Iran. I mean, I think it's in the same piece that I talk about how, the New York Times has, since this summer and the leak of that opinion on Roe v. Wade, overturning Roe v. Wade, has run these columns by various upper middle class white women lamenting, what has happened to the Malays in the feminist movement, and just all these kinds of very morose sounding pieces. And it's baffling to me that that can be published at a time when women facing arguably the most repression have dared to rise up and lead a protest movement. And I point that out because that is what I mean by the inability of the white and Western world to see leadership emanating from non-Western countries, rather than imagining that those non-Western women in those countries are sitting there twiddling their thumbs, hoping Simone de Beauvoir will show up and free them from the veil. But that is a very central and kind of a central source of discrimination against feminist movements that are non-Western.
Mm-hmm.
And so for white women, I mean, you were talking about the cutting of the hair and stuff. For white and Western women's actions to be seen as genuine, and sort of not out of this, centuries long paternalism. I think that there has to be that recognition, the recognition that, these women are much braver, and they are a chapter of the international feminist movement, just in the way the suffragists were in the 1920s.
Yes.
So I mean, I feel really strongly, that.
And then there've been and there've been also these articles, haven't there, of sort of focusing on Iranian women in the United States and giving them the agency of somehow they are the ones who really running the show, rather than recognizing that this is coming from, as you said, authentic Iranians in Iran, women struggling every day with their colleagues, men and older people, younger people. That it's a grassroots movement. It's coming authentically from Iran. The other thing was also that I wanted to sort of ask you a bit about is this selective outrage at the moment. So there's very little female, I would say very little. There's no female solidarity here in Europe for French policing of the hijab and the burkini, for instance. So, they're very furious about Afghanistan and Pakistan and, in the Gulf countries as well, when women are forced to wear the hijab. But really, if it's a question of choice, as some commentators have pointed out, then you should be as angry about being asked to take off the veil, forcing women to take off the veil. But that does not happen. And then the focus is not, it's very much on Iran and Afghanistan, but Muslim women in India also face very draconian, very harsh punishments if they're wearing the hijab. So there is a selective outrage, which I would say sort of reveals double standards in our narratives about what happens to Muslims and where it happens to them.
Yes, absolutely. I see in all of this a potential for a larger internationalist feminist movement, in that women are all, I mean, there are other things we're fighting for, but there's a central sort of fight for bodily autonomy that has now become international, because while its iterations might be different, right? So being forced to wear the hijab in one place, being forced to be pregnant in another place, you know, just all of these sorts of different iterations that, protecting a woman's body from police violence in another place. All of these are attacks on female bodily autonomy, and ones that, men don't face. I mean, I don't think there's a man in the world who understands what it's like to sort of face this lack of agency over your own body and what you do with it. And in that, I see a lot of potential for the reinvigoration of the feminist movement at the transnational level, that is further enabled by the virtual space and other similar modes of interaction. But in each context, men are, standing in between women and the possibility of solidarity, because they want to tell women in each context that your context is so different that it's not really, there isn't a universal nub here for you to cohere around. But I think that we are at the beginning now of that sort of consciousness. And, to the extent that Western European, American, etc., women are watching this happen and sort of scratching their heads on, well, how do I, yes, and or participate, or, I think that, they have to look within their own context and see where the oppression is located. Whether it's, people pulling off hijabs off women in London, or, like you talked about the burkini, other ways, in Louisville, you have Breonna Taylor sleeping in her bed, who's shot by, state forces. All of those are iterations of the same thing, where, the world is in tumult. And as a response to that turmoil, men have turned even more viciously against women. And women, therefore, are bearing the brunt of, lost jobs. There are many, many women in the US, and I'm sure even in Europe, who are facing the brunt of job losses post-COVID.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
Exactly. And so in that sense, they share that with Iranian women. And because it's kind of like this unsaid thing where, when we start creating jobs again, we'll mostly give them to men. And then if there are any left over, maybe we'll let the women, it's not stated quite so explicitly, but that is what's happening, because women are being saddled with care work that they're not compensated for. And in that sense, that might not be a legal edict against their presence in the public space, but it is a presence in their public. It is a form of repression, because if you put women all inside homes and they're doing all the care work, their capacity to participate in democratic processes and influence policy and, be present are all impacted.
Yes, absolutely.
There's no law saying, oh, you stay at home now in Belgium, or you stay at home now in Paris. But if they're doing that work, of course, their capacity to participate is severely impeded.
Absolutely. And I think as we go towards this world of, economic slowdowns and more economic difficulties, this is going to be a real challenge for women, because we're going to be ladled with all the, as you said, all the informal, unpaid work. This was a very important discussion actually in Brussels just a couple of days ago at the Gender Equality Forum that I participated in as well. So women have got a little bit more power in terms of politics and boardrooms. It's marginally more than before, but they're losing on all other fronts. So that's really a paradox that I think needs further investigation. But I wanted to ask you, you've said something really, I think, really, really important, which is that there should be a global female solidarity movement around attacks on bodily autonomy. I think that, and you said that could be the beginning of a new movement across the world. Do you see that happening? Do you see there's some kind of spark that's been lit now, and that there's this deeper understanding of what's happening in Iran has actually sort of been understood by female feminist leaders in the West and in the global South?
I'm a feminist, and I have faith in the power of women coming together. So, I mean, of course, I can, in my perspective, it is possible for something like that to exist. And it's possible not simply because, because of what women are facing, but also because the means of connection have become disengaged from state power. And what I mean by that is that 20 years ago, or, even I would say maybe 10 years ago when I began writing, I mean, it was kind of the beginning of this, but women relied on transnational institutions like the UN and like, the post-Bretton Woods institutions to have that exchange with each other, right?
That's true.
And
yes.
These convenings like Beijing and et cetera, et cetera. And that was sort of the mechanism that kind of defined that interaction. But now with the sort of virtual realms of communication democratized and available, there's really, it's possible to have alternative and yet robust means of creating solidarity that are not dependent on those transnational institutions and their naming and shaming sort of politics that were at the state level. So so that's what's different, I would say, from 20 years ago, is that it's possible to communicate with people with very little cost and create even sort of basic understandings of solidarity among women. So I see tremendous hope in that. I don't think that that makes transnational institutions and their leadership redundant, but it does mean that that those exchanges can be a lot more frequent than your conference every 3 years in some city. Not that those conferences, I mean, I'm not.
No, I understand what you're saying. No, you're not. I understand. I mean, this brings us to the point of, civil society actions, networks that are being created in the informal sector are becoming extremely powerful because of what you've said. And they need to be part of this conversation on multilateralism and, global challenges. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Just to come back now to the events in Iran. Here in Brussels, the European Union, they have, as you said earlier, imposed sanctions. And since Amini's death, there have been more sanctions imposed on people who were involved, obviously. And there have been also calls for an effective and impartial investigation. So I'm just wondering, what can one do? Now, we know that the leadership in Iran is basically impervious to this kind of criticism. In fact, it can have the the worst impact and can have exactly the opposite impact, they become even more ferocious, more furious, more enraged, and even more brutal in their response. Does that leave us any room for actually making any impact apart from showing this solidarity? How do we actually encourage and ensure that this movement gets a successful end, achieves a successful end?
Unfortunately, and this is a condition that has arisen post-war on terror, where these sorts of feminist precepts were, as I've pointed out, used by the US and allies in general to kind of, bring democracy to places and bring feminism to women in Afghanistan.
Yeah, Afghanistan was the case, wasn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, that sort of the consequence, sadly, of that has been a delegitimization of Western offers to assist anybody, women particularly. So I think that in that sense, it can feel very unsatisfactory to a lot of Western powers, women, foreign ministers, etc., to just sit back and say, okay, well, we're going to do nothing. But that's where they are. I mean, I think that at this point, any sorts of overt, declarations. I mean, on the best case scenario would be that they have no impact at all, because the people who are protesting on the streets of Iran aren't getting anything from anybody. And they don't really care. I mean, they want their lives to get better, which is precisely how it should be. And in the worst case, it would be a complete tainting of a very ground up process that is happening in Iran. But I mean, I think ideally, it should be a moment for Western societies and other people who are invested in this to see what ruin they have created, because what happened from imposing those sorts of ideals that are now erupting from the ground up is that they were associated. I mean, they essentially delegitimized any sort of feminist movement as, inherently connected to Western interests. So there's that. But beyond that, I mean, I think that it's very important, for instance, to consider what Iran needs at a humanitarian level. Mm. These things are not often, talked about as much. Mass uprising is also in its own way a humanitarian disaster, in that you now have these societies that are caught in turmoil. People could already not afford food, right. And now they're not going to be able to afford food even more. So I think that sort of apolitical kind of engagement is a possibility. But insofar as political engagement, it's not. I mean, I don't think the West can do that. And if there is such a desire to do that, perhaps it can be turned on itself and be a moment of reckoning for why this was such a problem and how it set Iranian women back for decades and decades, because that meddling was tied to this top down, don't wear the veil, wear this mini skirt type of type of idea.
Right. So just final question. So if the West can't do it, if the Europeans and Americans can't do it, if this female solidarity being shown is really just sort of having very little impact, what about the Muslim world? What about Muslim women? Don't these constituencies have the power? Don't Muslim governments? I know that Iran doesn't get along with many of its neighbors, but wouldn't that be a powerful leverage if women in the Muslim world were to show more solidarity? I know you've written about how women in Pakistan should become allies and amplify the voices of their neighbors in Iran. Isn't that a channel that should be much more used, if you like? Would be more potent, right?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly because many women in the Muslim world are facing, these direct curbs on their bodily autonomy. You mentioned India. India has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, and the situation there is absolutely terrifying in terms of what the radical right-wing Hindutva movement that their current prime minister belongs to is doing to Muslim women, how they're trying to use them as pawns in a very, very deadly game, how their bodily autonomy is constantly threatened, and I think that there have been overtures. For instance, I definitely heard about several in Indonesia where women also fear that they're going to face a crackdown, and they're going to face forcible veiling and things like that. So I think that the impetus comes from a particular context, but it creates a network of understanding, so to speak. These might not be movements that are sort of sitting there and plotting strategy at this time, but their awareness of that existence can create what I would consider a two-layered sort of movement. On one hand, you have your local context in that you are, engaged in fighting, and then you have like an international context that brings all of these common threads together. So I think that that's possible. I think Muslim women will be taking the lead. I believe in the feminist movement of the future because, like I said, they are the most mobilized right now. Muslim women are the most mobilized feminists in the world at this moment. They are the ones who are in the streets in a way that nobody in the West is on the streets, and trying to reclaim public space, trying to reclaim autonomy, trying to reclaim religious edicts, trying to reclaim the understanding of faith, the understanding of democratic and public participation. So in that sense, I do see a lot of hope there because I mean, not to say that other feminists are not doing similar sorts of actions, but of course, the most risky action ever is coming out on the street and directly confronting state forces. And when you think about that, it is Muslim women that are doing that right now. And so I think the world, to the extent that it's interested or engaged in, or wanting, has a desire to help with this, the help has to come in the provision of due respect and the centering of Muslim women as a very epochal and kind of robust fifth wave that is entirely centered, in the actions that they are doing. So to that extent, I do think, I suppose that Western media in particular has a particular responsibility in not seeing that as like a belated awakening, that maps onto the Western past, but rather a future that is no longer located in the West for the feminist movement.
That was brilliant. Thank you. That's such an important, I mean, you've really taken this into a direction that I really value. And because what you've said is basically looking ahead. And what you've done is just focus on the things that bring us together and how we can actually work together in recognizing the bravery, the courage, and providing support, but not necessarily in terms of rescuing them, but in terms of being there. So thank you. Thank you very much, Rafia.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.